Last year, I did an interview with American journalist Tucker Carlson about the reality and plight of Palestinian Christians. The interview was viewed by millions and received a lot of attention and contention. Because how dare I accuse Israel of oppressing Palestinian Christians? You see, the assumption is that if Palestinian Christians are going through hard times, then it must be because of Palestinian Muslims. This is the result of years of systematic dehumanization of Arabs and Muslims, but also I would argue a deliberate attempt by the Zionist camp to portray the conflict as religious between two forces, on the one hand the Judeo-Christian tradition, and on the other hand Islam, forces of good versus forces of evil. Now, for us as Palestinian Christians, we have always emphasized, if you want to know about our reality and challenges, aspirations, please talk to us, not about us. And this is one of the reasons at least, why we started this podcast. And today, we have an exceptional guest, an expert in her field, and an important Palestinian Christian voice in the field of human rights. Today, we welcome Dalia Qumsieh, a human rights lawyer specializing in legal human rights advocacy. She holds the Palestinian bar from 2013. She's the founder and director of Balasan Initiative for Human Rights in Palestine. Dalia is a graduate of Birzeit University of Law, something we share. I also went to Birzeit. I studied engineering. Dalia then graduated. She did her graduate degree in international law and international administration from the Law School of the University of Paris 1, Pantheon, Sorbonne, in Paris, France. And prior to establishing the Balasan Initiative, she worked in various Palestinian human rights organizations as senior legal advocacy consultant. Dalia, welcome, and thank you for joining our podcast.
Thank you for hosting me, Reverend Munther.
We wanted to do this for a long time, and I'm glad it finally worked. Before we delve into the issue of Palestinian Christians, the reality and challenges, tell us about Balasan, what it is. What are you doing in Balasan? Why did you start it?
Yes, so basically Balasan is a Palestinian independent human rights organization, but it takes the identity of a Palestinian Christian human rights organization. It was established in 2021, duly registered, and it is based in Bethlehem. Now, the name Balasan, really, I took my time in thinking about the name. Balasan is, in Arabic, the name of an indigenous tree that has existed in our homeland in Palestine for thousands of years, to the extent where it was mentioned in the Holy Bible. So in a way, Balasan, with the name, I sought to reflect our connection to this land as indigenous people, as Palestinians, and as Christians. And we still use the leaves of the Balasan tree in our traditional medicine. My grandma used to use it a lot. And the philosophy behind that is, with the work that we are doing, we try to remedy the injustices that are ongoing in our homeland, Palestine. Now, I kept the name Initiative because whatever we do is an initiative eventually. We don't want to have this big ego of organizations. We are an initiative. We contribute as an initiative. And if you look at the logo, it really sums up who we are. You have the ba in Arabic, and then it's held through a pen, and that's our weapon. And then you have the Libra, the scale of justice, which is what we seek to do, and the leaves of the Balasan tree. Now, we don't confine ourselves to specific areas or favorite violations. We don't do that. We give ourselves mandate in many issues. We have worked on a variety of issues like land rights, forcible displacement, annexation, religious tourism and its impact on Palestinian Christians, cultural religious rights. We do a lot of work with the youth, capacity building, the development, the right to development. So we give ourselves a vast mandate.
And all of this touches on Palestinian Christians. I've always said there is no Christian solution. You can't just solve the issue of Palestinian Christians, right? When you talk about land rights, it impacts all Palestinians,
Yes.
including Palestinian Christians.
And this is precisely the methodology, or if you want, even the aim of Balasan. Like, we examine human rights violations comprehensively, how they impact everyone, but we always shed light on how they impact Palestinian Christian components, because in our opinion, we believe that they are under serious threat at this point, and we would like to fortify Palestinian Christian components and elevate our narratives as Palestinian Christians. So the methodology is we collect the facts, we apply policy and legal analysis, we examine the consequences and impacts of the policies on everyone, and we shed light also on Palestinian Christians, and then we make the recommendations.
Yes, this is very important. I know we want to talk on whether Christians are targeted here. But what most people miss is that Christians are part and parcel of the Palestinian people. And something you mentioned that I think merit highlighting is when you talked about Palestinian Christians as the indigenous people of the land. What did you mean by that?
I mean, this is naturally, this is the birthplace of Christianity. I mean, we are factually and historically one of the oldest Christian denominations in the world. This is where Christianity started. On this land, Jesus lived, walked, preached, and,
So you were not converted by a Western missionary or?
Absolutely not.
It's funny, sometimes when people ask us, when were you converted? We say, well, we converted you, not the other way around.
It's literally that, it is like that. Christians were here before the Muslims, for example. And here it is common knowledge that many of the current Muslims were at some point Christians before converting to Islam.
When we talk about the political reality here, I think many times we miss this idea of Palestinians, and particularly Palestinian Christians, being part of the indigenous people of the land. Because when we talk about a conflict, it distorts the reality of settler colonialism that sought to eliminate the indigenous people. That's why I highlighted this, because I think it's one of the most crucial yet often missed components when people talk about what's happening in Palestine.
Absolutely.
Now, we want to talk about Palestinian Christians. And when I talk about Palestinian Christian, I sense that there is always the assumption that we're talking about one people group in one political reality. Now, we're certainly one people, but we're in different political realities.
Yes.
We have been fragmented, I would argue, by design since the creation of the State of Israel, to the extent that today you find Palestinian Christians in the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, in citizens of Israel. And of course, most people are surprised to know that the majority of Palestinian Christians no longer live in the land and are not allowed to even visit the land. So I think it's important to help us understand these different components, these different political realities of who Palestinian Christians are and where are we today.
Absolutely. I think this is reflective of Israel's colonial policies of artificially, as you said, by design, artificially dividing the land. And then this geographic division is then reflected administratively. So basically, we're talking about administrative and geographic division of the land. And the aim of this is basically to prevent the unity among Palestinian people, to ensure the permanence of Israel, of the Israeli control over all of historic Palestine, and then to alter the demographic elements in favor of Israel. So basically achieve a Jewish Israeli majority all over historic Palestine. The result of this is that we basically have 5 categories under which Palestinians and Palestinian Christians as part of the Palestinian people are placed. So the first one are the Nakba survivors, those who survived the Nakba and stayed in what has become the present-day Israel.
The Nakba as in what happened in 1948?
Yes.
When Israel was created, close to 800,000 Palestinians, including Palestinian Christians, by the way.
Yes.
Were forcibly displaced.
Yes, and Palestinian Christian villages were ethnically cleansed. And the majority or the concentration of Palestinian Christians was in these areas. It was not
in Galilee.
Yes.
And they were completely cleansed. No one talks about this. No one talks about the fact that entire Palestinian Christian villages no longer exist.
Yes, I invite people to research the cases of Iqrith and Bir'im. These are Palestinian Christian villages which were ethnically cleansed, and the people, its inhabitants were not allowed to return, even with a court decision. So I invite them to research that. But
so some survived.
Yes, the survivors of the Nakba, the Palestinians who remained in what has become present-day Israel, have received an Israeli citizenship. However, the discrimination against them is enshrined in law. So, beside the quasi-constitutional nation-state law, and they are, by the way, 20%, it says
20% of the population of the state of Israel.
Yes, 20%.
And they include Christians as well, but the Palestinians,
of course, yes.
Muslims and Christians.
Yes, and even Jews. We tend to forget that there were always Palestinian Jews that we were deprived from. It was one of our historic components as Palestinian people through forced assimilation. But anyway, these are 20%, and the Jewish nation-state law basically says that the right of determination is solely granted to Jewish Israelis. So what happens to these 20%, holders of the Israeli citizenship?
I think we can just bypass this. So the right for national self-determination is exclusive to the Jewish people only.
Yes.
That's what the state of Israel declares.
It's the Jewish nation-state law.
Is there an equivalent in another country? Imagine if this happened in France, Europe, or United States.
I don't know about anything like that.
If now the Congress passes the law, the right for self-determination is exclusive to Christians, to white Christians, or whatever. I mean, the idea that this just passes and people continue to talk about Israel as the only democracy shocks me.
And then not only that, mind you, there are 56 laws that discriminate against Israeli citizens who are Palestinians. And these are very well documented as well. So, everything we say here is easily, people can research it and find all the information. And also they live in impoverished communities, underrepresented, politically, even repressed. It's a very tough and difficult reality, even for Palestinians who hold an Israeli citizenship.
Now, this is important, and I know they certainly have, in comparison to us here in the West Bank, many privileges. But there's always the assumption that since they vote and they are represented in the Knesset, Israel is a functional democracy and they have equal rights. And you're telling us it's not as it looks.
No, not at all. I mean, of course, they'll tell you we have Arab, they call them Arab, they don't say Palestinian. Arab judges and Arab, I don't know what, taking Knesset official members, Knesset members. But the reality of things is there is a very evident case of discrimination. I mean, how more evident can it get than, having it enshrined in a quasi-constitutional law?
Like the nation-state law. So that's category one, those who survived the Nakba. And I like how you put it, Nakba survivors.
Yes.
And then there are West Bank, East Jerusalem.
Yes. So then the second category is those who hold a Jerusalem ID. It is known as the permanent resident status. So Israel occupied Jerusalem and then illegally annexed it, but then considered the people, the Palestinians, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, as mere residents, as if they came and resided. They were there all along. These are the indigenous people of Jerusalem. But the problem with that status is also that it's very peculiar. It's an inferior status. It's not a citizenship. And so basically it doesn't confer citizenship rights.
So they are citizenless? We can say that about
second-class citizen would be a good way to frame this, and it's very easily revocable. And with time, we have seen Israel passing laws that make it even more easy to revoke this status. And then the discrimination is also obvious in their case. And there's always this suspicion that, Israel looks at Jerusalemites with a lot of suspicion that they need to prove that their center of life is Jerusalem, otherwise they lose the status. They cannot have automatic status for family reunification. The process has been frozen since 2003. So it's a very also drastic reality. They pay very high taxes in return. They barely get municipal services. So if you look at a Jewish Israeli residing in Jerusalem, even those who reside illegally in settlements, it's a completely different reality.
Well, that's why we call it apartheid, but we'll get into that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something about those who hold an East Jerusalem ID. If they can't prove that their center of life is Jerusalem, their residency can be revoked.
Yes.
What happens then? They can go to the West Bank or...
Yeah, go to the West Bank, go abroad. If we want to go into the details of how you can lose your status as a Jerusalemite, it's a whole separate episode. But one of the conditions, you need to prove that your center of life is Jerusalem. So the municipality will come, will open your house, will check your trash to see if you're actually living there. Will open the fridge, will check the toothpaste even, and to see that you're actually living in this.
Of course, this is primarily against the Palestinians who were originally in Jerusalem, but now are subjected to this.
It does not apply to Jewish Israelis. There's no center of life requirement for them.
So just for the Palestinians?
It's only for Palestinians, Palestinian Jerusalemites.
And that's why they call it apartheid. When we explain these things to people, I ask, imagine if this exists in any other context. Imagine if in the city of Philadelphia, you have to prove that your center of life is Philadelphia, but only if you're Black or Hispanic, but not the others. The logic of it, and you're the indigenous, the Palestinians we're talking about were there, their families were there long before Israel was created.
Absolutely. And, it's so surreal, but the problem is it's a whole system. The system is by design this way. And you look at the Palestinians, they have to defend themselves in a very unfavorable system where, it's not to mention the language, of course, and the linguistic barrier, but also the legislators are Israeli, the judges are Israeli, the municipality and the enforcement are Israeli. And you're fighting in the midst of that just to stay in your land.
And again, we're talking about an entire group of Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem. That includes Palestinian Christians. One of the things we can also talk about is the permits to build homes, which is almost impossible to get if you're a Palestinian, easy to get if you're an Israeli Jew. And as a result, housing has become a priority for many churches. How do we create housing for the Christian community just to keep them in Jerusalem? It's ridiculous.
Honestly, I think we don't have the time and the capacity to cover all the themes here. But, also housing and house demolitions and discriminatory planning system in Jerusalem, but also in the areas that Israel occupied in 1948, where you have Palestinian communities that are constantly demolished time and again. Also the demolitions in the West Bank. I think we will need another podcast episode to also cover this.
So, and then there are Palestinians in the West Bank.
Yes. So the first category, if you want to imagine it as a pyramid, top of the pyramid is those who hold an Israeli citizenship. Then comes the Jerusalem ID, if you want, or the permanent residents. And then third is us, West Bankers, what they call us West Bankers. So people who hold a West
Judea
Bank
and
ID.
Samaria, Huckabee says we should call it. And now it's going to become a law, I think, in the Congress. West Bankers.
We'll still call it the occupied Palestinian territories, the West Bank. So, and territory, by the way, not territories. Territory. It's one territory. These divisions are artificial, and I insist, it's one territory. So, Basically, in the West Bank, we are subjected under a brutal military occupation that dictates all aspects of our lives, all of them. Where you work, your access to health, to education, where your kids go to school, for example, whom you marry, because different IDs, there's a freeze on the family unification process, and even whom you can marry, because it's not for granted that if you hold a West Bank ID that you can marry a person who has a Jerusalem ID, because then you have to find a way to live in Jerusalem. There's a freeze on the family unification process. If you have kids, they don't have automatic status because you're Palestinians.
But it's not just a Jerusalem ID. If a Palestinian Christian marries an American,
yes,
their life becomes a challenge.
Absolutely. And the number of people who have left Palestine because of this, because they have foreign spouses. And us Palestinians, we have no control over our borders. We don't control the population registry, who gets to stay, the visa process. It's controlled by Israel exclusively and arbitrarily. So many people, in absence of this status for their foreign spouses, they get tourist visas for 3 months or 6 months renewable. It's a state of chronic uncertainty that then they decide to leave because of these things. There are many Palestinian Christians that have left because of these.
And I have many friends. And you mentioned the uncertainty. In some cases, I mean, that's assuming they get the tourist visa or the spouse visa. In the case of one of my best friends, they couldn't even get the visa, the tourist visa.
There's no guarantee.
And they had to leave.
You cannot guarantee it. That's the thing. Yani it's, as I said, it's an arbitrary decision that pertains only, even when they say we only want to visit like the occupied Palestinian territory, we want to be in the West Bank. And this happened to also family members of mine. They said, we just want to visit our family in Bethlehem.
They won't let them.
Denied.
And to me, it's a cruel system. I always say this. It's a very cruel system. And it's one of those realities that shows the blatant discrimination. You see, you have an indigenous Palestinian Christian from Bethlehem, family roots, hundreds, if not more, of years in Bethlehem, and they can't live here because they want to be with their spouse.
Yes.
You have a Jew born in Brooklyn who could move next day to a settlement outside of Bethlehem, and today certainly we have illegally. Well, Israel now, if they decide it's legal, they decide it's legal. That's the thing. I mean, do we really believe anymore in the international law? So they can come and live in a land confiscated by Palestinians, possibly Palestinian Christians, where there is a settlement that's established, get more rights than all of us, carry weapons and control our lives. Today in Bethlehem, if I'm not mistaken, there's almost the same number of Jewish settlers than the same number of Jewish settlers to Palestinians. I mean, just think of this. The number of settlers who keep coming in, taking our land, taking our identity even, settling in areas that were historically Palestinian. And you got Palestinians who just can't live here and stay here because of these laws of occupation.
It's a very coercive environment. And this comes not only at the expense of land, it impacts a wide set of your fundamental rights, beginning from the right to self-determination and all the other rights that ensue. Freedom of movement, for example. We have been locked in these small municipal compounds, but now even more. Yeah. So basically, those of us who hold a West Bank ID, it's a brutal military occupation that dictates all aspects of our lives. That's even becoming more grim, especially in the current state of politics nowadays. And where we are disconnected not only from going to other Palestinian cities within the West Banks, but now even within the same Palestinian cities and towns, we're not able to reach anymore. We, both of us, my son and your children, attend the same school. Yeah. And now there has been a military gate that was installed.
90 gates were installed outside of Bethlehem just in the last year or so.
This is within Beit Sahur. I mean, for what purpose? Other than subjugation and the deliberate creation of a very oppressive environment.
And I don't know about your child. I mean, my children, whenever we pass and there's a soldier with a gun, I keep wondering, what psychological impact does that have?
It's a dilemma for us parents
When
here.
every day we pass through that checkpoint, and we know it's there for no point whatsoever. I mean, they just delay and harass, and they can claim everything is done for security. Of course, they have been doing so, building settlements under the pretext of security, preventing us from digging for water under the pretext of security.
We know this as human rights lawyers in specific, those of us who this is our area of expertise, and security is the pretext for every single policy of the occupation. It's always security. Security of whom and at the expense of what? Like it's a settlement, for example, and then the settlement is established, it expands, and then there's a buffer zone for the settlement. There's another buffer zone for the road of the settlement, and another buffer zone for the street that serves the settlement. And then we're not allowed to be even present in these areas because we are a threat to the security. The settlement, its infrastructure, the annexation wall are all illegal under international law. These are the security threats to us.
And for those who've been following the plights of Palestinian Christians more recently in the last few years, we've talked a lot about areas like Ramzan, Al-Makhrour. Prior to that, I don't know if people remember Abu Ghnaim outside of Beit Sahur, which now became a settlement, and we fear the same will happen to Makhrour at Ramzan. These are historically agricultural land that belonged to Palestinian Christian communities and now are being confiscated.
Absolutely. They're under the immediate threat of annexation. These are our last green and open space areas left for us. Bethlehem had plenty of green spaces and open areas. They were all taken for the settlement enterprise and its infrastructure. And now these are the last one. But these are also specifically important because they're part of a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So they're not only important for Palestine, they're also important for all of humanity. They're prescribed as such, and they're super rich in terms of the ecological system. So it will be very harmful if they are actually annexed, and they are on the way to being annexed.
And we know what happens. They annex them and build settlements on them.
Yes.
They uproot the trees. It's
Absolutely.
happened in many cases.
We have seen it. And then also, as you said, they're very connected to the Palestinian Christian culture and heritage here. In Kremizan, these are church lands for a monastery, for convent, for the families who are mainly Christian. And in Al-Makhrour, 91.5% of the ownership of that valley belongs to Palestinian Christians. So, taking the land is not only about, taking the source of livelihood. It's not only robbing you from the economic impact, it's also robbing you from your history and your future. Because the moment you lose hope that tomorrow will be a better day is the moment where, and we have seen that in the Kremizan when some of the olive trees were uprooted, Roman olive trees.
Wow.
Some family members filed for immigration. They lost the land, they lost the access to the land, they lost their olive groves.
That was the reason to stay, basically, because
not only their, all of their past and their ancestral land, but really it severed their tie to the land and their future in it. But so if we go back to the hierarchy of the ideas.
But I think it's important before we go back to the hierarchy, and we'll definitely do that. When we think of the Palestinian Christian community, especially prior to the creation of the State of Israel, when I think the percentage was 12% or maybe more, close to that. And we think of the concentration historically, they were connected to the biblical sites, Galilee, Nazareth, and we've seen what happened with the Nakba. Many left. We go to Jerusalem, and now we're seeing another Nakba with these revoking the IDs and of Jerusalemites, and the number and of Christians in Jerusalem is definitely decreasing. Now, the third concentration has always been Bethlehem, and we've seen people leaving, no land, no opportunities. I think it's important to connect the details of what Israel has been doing since 1948 to today, and then connect it to the And I don't want to say immigration of Palestinian Christians. It's forcible displacement
Yes.
of Palestinian Christians. And sadly, in the past, if you go hundreds of years ago, Gaza was one of the biggest concentrations. It was a missionary hub. It was a place for many monasteries. And before the war started, there was close to, I think, 1,000 Palestinian Christians in Gaza. And now we go back to the pyramid.
Yes.
Hard to believe what we've described about the West Bank, that there are still two categories below the West Bank. Gaza is one of them.
Yes, but let me make a very important comment on immigrate and leave. Palestinian Christians immigrate and Palestinian Christians leave. Do they really leave in the sense of, leave gives a sense of electivity, like you have the freedom to make this choice to leave. You made a
choice for your,
and then you leave. But, forcible transfer legally is, yes, there's this forcible element where you are taken out of the land, but there's also the deliberate creation of a coercive environment that then forces you to leave.
Yeah, you cannot say, so you take all other options.
Absolutely. And this is labeled as forcible displacement legally also.
This is what's happening right now in Gaza. Let's be very clear. I mean, they destroyed everything in Gaza with this genocide. We can talk about the ecocide, the destruction of all elements of life and nature and water. Everything. The educide, the universities are destroyed. And now they're offering Palestinians in Gaza, including the few hundred Palestinian Christians who stayed, a humanitarian solution to go to another country. And I think Trump wants to give the impression that he's being not just, humanitarian, but kind and generous and trying to push other countries because he cares for us. But you describe that as forcible displacement.
And it's a war crime. It's a very grave violation and a war crime. It's not a joke in international law.
Well, I don't think, honestly, U.S. cares anymore. I mean, when Trump openly says, I want to own Gaza, I mean, does he even care about international law or human rights?
Obviously not. I wouldn't even say he doesn't care about international law. I say, there's no humanity it's very dehumanizing the way he talks about, not only Gaza, but, the rest of Palestine.
And when it comes to Gaza, what we're hearing is interesting because some would describe exactly what you said. There's no more life in Gaza. We want to leave because, and I can't blame them. Their homes are destroyed. No one knows how long it's going to take until life is rebuilt. No schools, no hospitals. So they think if we have an opportunity, at least for our children. What's interesting is that others say we will stay no matter what, including Christians, which I find is really fascinating, how much rooted they are in the land and how much determination and steadfastness they have. But the situation in Gaza has always been, especially in the last 16 years before October 7th, has been terrible. It's a blockade. It's inhumane.
Absolutely. And this takes me to, if we go back to the pyramid, under the West Bank, you have the Gaza ID. Is even more restricted than the West Bank ID because of the blockade that you mentioned since 2007.
But the blockade, what they say, and how do we answer? How would you answer? It's self-defense, they're terrorists, they're Hamas, and so on. And under that pretext, they imprisoned 2 million people.
2.3 million people. And let's remember that at least 75% of those are refugees.
Nakba.
So they were displaced, forcibly displaced in the Nakba, and then they came to Gaza. So, I'm not really interested in the Israeli hasbara and propaganda points. We do law here. We analyze things from the lens of international law. This is our basis. It's a case of a blockade, collective punishment. It's a case of occupation because we heard this a lot that, in Gaza, there is no occupation. Yes, it is definitely a case of occupation. Occupation has a definition and standards that apply in Gaza. This has been confirmed multiple times,
Well, they control who comes in and out. I mean, what more do you
absolute
need?
control to the extent of counting the calories that the Palestinians, the residents of Gaza, would need. And this calculation would determine the number of trucks that would be allowed into Gaza before October the 7th. So it was a very drastic situation. I mean, we have documented cases of children who were given permits to go have cancer treatment in the hospitals of Jerusalem alone, unaccompanied with their mothers.
Yeah.
It was that much of a suffocation in this.
Again, it's so cruel when you.
I cannot. It's unfathomable.
Won't even allow the mother of a cancer patient, a child cancer patient, to go be with that child receiving cancer treatment in Jerusalem.
Reverend Munther, we're always focused on the numbers in our reporting. So, for example, Israel, and we're talking before October the 7th, years before, like Israel gave 50 permits for Palestinians to have treatment in Gaza. If you go into the details and the human misery and suffering behind each number, these are things that you cannot measure. Like, how do you measure the trauma of a child who has to go receive treatment in Jerusalem for cancer on his own? If your child gets a flu, you tend for them and you care for them the whole time and you feel terrible and, they need a lot of love and nurturing, and it's just a flu, Imagine. And we're talking before October the 7th. We haven't tackled the psychological trauma, which I think no one's really addressing nowadays. Amputations.
Before October 7th, but much more now.
Much more now.
Children without parents, surviving children, diseased parents, which is now.
I don't think we have the capacity or the adequate language to comprehend what's been going on in Gaza alone. And, we still haven't talked about the West Bank, which is also a very drastic case.
Honestly, someone in Bethlehem, it's terrible here. We're surviving. But I feel ashamed talking about our situation when I think of what's happening in Gaza. I feel embarrassed, really.
We have this sense of shame. That's very unfortunate. We have now come to prioritize. If you have been subjected to a graver violation like genocide, then, this is what you talk about. Anything else?
That doesn't mean that anything else is less
absolutely
evil, I would say.
If you think the work we're doing here at Across the Divide is important and the conversations we're having are necessary, then I invite you to consider becoming a patron of the podcast, a monthly supporter of Across the Divide on patreon.com/Across the Divide. You can support us for as little as $5 a month and get access to various kinds of premium content like extended episode conversations, merch options, and the ability to have conversations with us and other Patreon supporters. You could also join us in frequent private meetings where we discuss previous episodes and plan for future conversations together on the podcast. So join the small and beautiful community of Across the Divide by signing up on patreon.com/Across the Divide.
So we've tackled about all the, and we could take for much more to talk about each category. I know it could take us maybe an entire episode just to highlight each in the pyramid. But then there is the biggest number of Palestinian Christians, those in the diaspora.
The diaspora and the refugees.
So they are two. I think it's important to highlight they're not just one, there are two.
Yes, what we're saying, the reason why we have them under one is that they're not physically in this area. But yes, the refugees who were displaced forcibly after the Nakba and are living in refugee camps in the region, in Jordan, in Syria, and Lebanon. And then the diaspora. Now, those, despite the right of return, and I say right because it's a right enshrined in international law.
There are decisions by the UN.
Yes, it's very well established in international law. Despite that, they are prohibited and prevented from returning to their homeland. However, and in contrast, if you want, any person around the globe who is Jewish or who claims Jewish ancestry can, according to the Israeli law of return, I think it's from 1950, return, I don't want to say return because they don't have any connection to the land prior to
Spiritual,
that.
religious, but does that mean if you visit here, you're returning, or if you're located here?
Not
That's
at all.
something I've always said, the spiritual, religious connection to the land should not translate into this becoming your homeland and now you're returning.
Forcible displacement of other at their expense.
Especially if it's, on the expense of others.
Absolutely. But then they can relocate in what has become present-day Israel, and they will get their full citizenship.
And deny those who have been living here for generations
the
right to even visit.
Yes. And this was, the biggest demographic alteration move that Israel has made. Ever since, we have witnessed others, but this was mainly how it started altering the demographics of Palestine.
And I think it's also important to highlight another element here. It's not just the refugees of 1948, because there were thousands who were not physically present in the land before 1948, including, by the way, a big number of Palestinian Christians, and who were later, after Israel was established, denied the right to return to their homes. When we say homes, they have the keys, The same happened in 1967 when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza. My relatives, my immediate relatives, my aunt now lives in Lebanon. She cannot even visit. Those are Palestinians and Palestinian Christians whose roots are here. But again, once Israel was established, they are denied the right to come and live here, even visit. And as you said, the law of return, all of this is the blatant discrimination, apartheid that we've been talking about, yet no one is listening. And we're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, close to 300,000-400,000 Palestinian Christians who live in the diaspora, whether refugees or in the diaspora. And whenever I hear the complaint that, the number of Palestinian Christians are dwindling, Israel is protecting Palestinian Christians, and we'll talk about this. I always say, well, if you want a immediate solution to the issue of the dwindling number of Palestinian Christians, well, grant the Palestinian Christians the right to return.
Yes, I mean,
it will immediately.
We talked about the percentage being around 12% the year before the Nakba.
Yeah.
Immediately after the Nakba, immediately after it, and I'm saying of Palestinian Christians, let me clarify this because it's important. The number or the percentage of the Palestinian Christian population the year just before the Nakba was around 12%. Right after the Nakba, the number dropped to 3%. If this is not, the ultimate proof of why the number has, dwindled massively, it's because of the establishment of the state of Israel. And then it continued to dwindle from 3%. We are now at 1%. And the numbers are decreasing even further. You know that specifically after October the 7th, many more Palestinian Christians
unfortunately
are leaving. And now we're really struggling with the numbers.
But this begs the question, because every time this issue is mentioned, the Zionist camp brings the figures of the dwindling number of Palestinians in the West Bank and say, look, ever since the Palestinian Authority came, they have been targeting and persecuting Palestinian Christians. That's why Palestinian Christians are leaving. Of course, it's as if here in the West Bank, we're completely free from any occupation. And I think that's an important question to answer. Why are Palestinian Christians leaving? And let's highlight the West Bank.
Yes.
Because that's where it seems the question always arises. And that's where it's always the Palestinians who are accused of pushing Palestinian Christians out.
Yes.
And I think it's deliberate why, it serves some to say Muslims are pushing Palestinian Christians out. So if someone asks you as an expert, as a legal expert, as a mother who lives here, why are families leaving? Why are Palestinian Christians leaving the land?
I mean, one thing is the Israeli propaganda and another is the reality. And the reality of things, and again, with the legal, applying the legal analysis, and that's basically my background. The deliberate creation of a coercive environment is one way of forcible is one kind of forcible displacement. Forcible displacement is a crime under international law. Now, the way to detect if there's a forcible displacement or not is to ask, in the absence of this coercive environment, would Palestinian Christians have stayed? If the answer is yes, then they were forcibly displaced. Now, if you look at we said that us living in the West Bank live under a brutal, Israeli occupation that dictates all the aspects of our life. What this means is that not only are we robbed from all our fundamental rights, but also we live in a situation where we have no dignity, no safety, no freedom, no respect for human rights, what have you. The way that this impacts the details of your life. We talked about land, the land being taken away from you. These are your livelihood, your resources, your development potential. In Bethlehem specifically, it's a governorate that relies on tourism. We haven't had a single tourist since October the 7th.
Economy is a factor for sure.
Economy and rural economy. In the hinterland of Bethlehem, where you have settlers attacking those who are herding, farmers unable to farm their lands and make use of them. They are resorting to farming methods that belong to 2 centuries ago, while Israeli settlers who are farming illegally the same land, whose presence on this land is illegal, benefit from the best services and resources and volunteers and farming machineries. Palestinian farmers, if they get machinery, if their land is located in Area C, for example, it will be confiscated. They will pay hefty fines. Not to mention the actual danger of being there, attacks by the settlers or the Israeli forces. So if you look at this lands, economy, freedom of movement, you can no longer go from anywhere to anywhere without really a lot of hassle and risking your life.
Freedom of movement even here in Bethlehem to Jerusalem, which is a 10-minute drive, historically a twin city. Jerusalem, and we in Bethlehem would like to think of ourselves as the little sister of Jerusalem. For the first time in history, Jerusalem and Bethlehem are disconnected,
separated.
We can't even work in Jerusalem. We rely on the permit system, which the military grants. I think it's from a legal perspective, right? Israel is solely responsible because they are the occupying power.
Yes.
So you can't just say, well, the Palestinian Authority, and I'm not here to defend the Palestinian Authority, but we have Christian mayors, we have people in decision-making positions in the Palestinian Authority, whether in Bethlehem or in Ramallah. Come and talk to us. Nothing is perfect, I know. But at the end of the day, I always say, come and live in our shoes.
Yes.
Before you speak on our behalf.
Absolutely. I agree. We are far from being perfect, but also, what is that expecting a perfect or a behavior of a perfect sovereign state when we are under colonization and apartheid? It's dysfunctional. The Palestinian authorities has its own problems, many problems. But I have yet to meet a Palestinian Christian who has left Palestine because of the Palestinian Authority or because of Palestinian Muslims. I haven't seen that yet. So in a sense, we know, we are living here. We know why people leave. And I find it absurd and even rude and very privileged for someone to come tell us our narrative and why we leave and how we should feel and how we should resist and what we should do. If you don't live in our shoes, if you don't know, if you're not living under this brutal occupation, you have no right to speak on our behalf. As simple as that. It's basic decency, actually.
And to me, it all has to do with the sense of security. And even when people within the Palestinian Authority don't feel secure, I always say we're not asking for privileges as Christians. We don't want anyone to protect us.
No. We are the indigenous people of the land,
We want to live in a system in which everyone is respected and live under the same law. and then we'll be
Absolutely.
fine.
And we're not asking for favors. These are our rights.
Basic rights. Now, and we need to wrap up here, but we hear a lot about this idea of not just annexation, that there is no occupation. It's all Judea and Samaria, according to some evangelical leaders who are now in positions of power, which scares me. And to me, it's giving Israel the green light to do whatever if there is no occupation. Annexation, what is it? Is it a good thing? Will it serve Christians? And those who are calling for it, especially Christian leaders, what would you tell them?
I mean, there are two options here, and I'm not sure which one is worse. The first is that they don't really know what annexation means and how it will impact or does impact our life, or that they don't care. And honestly, to be honest, I don't know which one is worse. But without going,
I agree. Yeah.
without going into legal jargons and what have you, simplified, annexation is the extension of the sovereignty of the occupying power into occupied territory, be it de facto with permanent presence and control, or it being de jure, which means legislating directly into occupied into occupied territory, in our case, occupied Palestinian territory. Both are de facto and de jure, both are illegal. International law is crystal clear when it comes to annexation. It's illegal. It cannot be legalized. It cannot. It's in basically they call it jus cogens, like it cannot be legalized. It's just illegal. There's no derogation to this rule. It's not debatable.
But how would it impact my life and your life? We are families who live in Bethlehem. We happen to be Palestinian Christian families who live in Bethlehem. How would that impact us?
Now, it's very important. It's a very important question, but it's important to put it in context. Israel has been laying the foundations for annexations for decades here.
It's been happening anyways.
It's been happening. What is, and I said de facto is permanent control with permanence, with the intention of it being permanent. And this is, for example, very obvious with the case of the settlements expanding, being linked together at the expense of Palestinian lands. So it has been happening, and it is a main theme now, but it's really important to note that this has been the case for decades. Like small decisions here and there, and then, bigger measures, military orders, bills, and what have you. How it will impact us, I think we have already been living under a situation of multi-layered, human rights violations that are going on as part of systems. So the system is designed in such a manner against you as a Palestinian. And with the annexation, I think it's going to get even worse. And we have been noting that, to be honest. In our domain, there's a significant spike, not only in the numbers of the violations, but also in the severity of the violations and with new trends of committing the violation. And if I want to put it shortly, we're moving from a very grim situation to a much more grim situation.
And my fear is that it would cause even more people to leave. With so much shrinking space to live in, it's not like the quality where we live in is, and with those gates now outside, literally outside of our neighborhoods, preventing us from going one place to the other, with the idea of no accountability. And when I hear of or think of pastors calling for that over against our existence, it shocks me. You ask, do they know or do they care? Honestly, I don't think they care, which is sad.
I tend to adopt this opinion that they don't care, because not knowing in this century, I mean, ignorance is a choice, in my opinion. You can always learn more.
Ignorance is definitely a choice, but I think in their worldview, they are supreme, they're superior. Their understanding of the Bible, of history, and of modern reality is definitely superior to ours, even if we live here, which is not only sad, it's dangerous. for those on the receiving end of this supremacy, of this notions that we know better, to the extent that you have now American pastors who could care less about, oh, what would the bishops in Jerusalem think? What would the pastors in Bethlehem or the priests in Bethlehem think? They could care less about our reality, even if that puts us in danger. And what shocks me, even if that puts the Christian presence in danger, and maybe it serves them. Maybe it's better if the Holy Land turns into museums so that they can control. I don't know. But it's really very, very dark days we live in. And we began by talking about those who talk about Palestinian Christians, sometimes even determining our fate, claiming they know what our problem is. So for those in the West who claim to be concerned about Palestinian Christians, yet then go on and back up ideas like annexation and other things. But those in general who claim to be concerned about Palestinian Christians, what do you say?
Honestly, I do not appeal to them. I don't appeal to those who claim to care at all. These are people who have these debates in the safety of their homes, with all the privileges that they have. They never lived one single day in our shoes. They don't understand what they're talking about. I think in this specific moment, we have to invest our effort, not appealing to this audience who claims to care, but rather to those who actually care and want to learn and want to understand and want to work with us. And to those I say, you have to look at the root causes of our fragmentation and oppression as Palestinians and as Palestinian Christians. You have to look it in the eye. You have to understand the source, the root cause of these systems, multi-layered systems of oppression. And when you do that, you have to elevate our narratives as Palestinians, as Christians, as the earliest denominations of Christianity in the world. And then you also have to think, how can I influence the decision-making process from a human rights lens, that all humans merit all their fundamental rights just for being human?
Well, we're all born in the image of God, and that's a foundational Christian tenet. I want to conclude with this question on we began with you, Balasan, and I'll bring it back. Do you still believe in human rights after a genocide happened, live on air, everyone watched? Do we believe in the international law? Should we continue to believe in the international law? It's a very difficult question today, when it seems that people in decision-making positions not only could care less about the international law, but seems to boast about destroying it, about trespassing it, and doing what they feel is right.
Mm-hmm.
Do you go to the office in the morning and ask yourself, why am I doing this?
Absolutely, every day. But let's dissect this question. You asked about, do I believe in human rights? What about the value of international law and why I do this work? Let's start by my belief in human rights. I don't only believe in human rights as, like this abstract ideal, or, something that would be nice to have or good to have. The way I perceive human rights is as an absolute human need, just like you need, air and food and, these are basic necessities and needs. This is how I see human rights. And for those of us who live in such oppressive, contexts and systems, we understand that the absence of human rights can cost you your whole survival. Yeah. So for me, human rights as basic as our survival. And that's why, we do the work that we do. And I'll go back to that point even when I answer why I do this work. But when it comes to international law, it's a very understandable question, especially for us as we monitor Israel basically devoiding international law of its whole purpose, without any consequences. But the way I look at international law is with a lot of expectations or management of expectations. It's a post-colonial tool, and it's not really meant to have like an immediate enforcement mechanism and challenge the political will of the global powers. So that we have to have this understanding. But still, I think it's one of the venues that we have. And as Palestinians, I think we must use every single venue and exhaust it in using it and try re-strategize and do it over again. There have been some, it has its shortages, it's not adequate. When we talk about terms like occupation and apartheid and, the ICC arrest warrant against Netanyahu and others, these mechanisms are not adequate at all. If you want to, they don't capture the full scale of what's going on here. It's frustrating that it's painfully slow and time costs us, like time is blood here. Yeah. But it's still a tool. And I adopt the position that instead of like dismantling all of the system because it doesn't work, no, let's protect it, let's reform it and make it more equitable and insist that it works instead of doing that. And we have seen some, some achievements that come a bit belated and are not adequate, like the ICC arrest warrants that have been unfortunately completely politicized without, accountability. But let's think of the alternative. Chaos. If there is, it's the logic of power that will reign the whole world. And this will be painful for everyone. Everyone will pay the price.
Not just Palestinians.
Not just Palestinians. And I think everyone's starting to get a taste of it in the current state of politics. Also, impunity travels. It crosses borders. Yeah. And this is an important point.
Yes, I say it's our collective humanity that is at stake. And
absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
As people of faith, we have to speak. We can't be silent.
Of course. And also, it's really important why we still have to do this work. If you adopt like this is, human rights are a need, it's a necessity. Why do I do this work despite it being frustrating? Sometimes we work on cases for several years and then the Israeli bulldozers arrive to a certain area and, they dismantle everything we did with the logic of power. And the logic of power slaps you really hard. It's bitter. But then...
what keeps you going?
It's as basic as, refusing to give up on my dignity, individual and collective, and hopefully restoring our collective dignity as Palestinians. It's as basic as refusing to accept that we're less of human beings, refusing to be severed from our ancestral homeland, this desire of wanting to know the rest of my homeland. I don't know my homeland. I'm not allowed to go to 2/3 of it, if not more.
No, more, yeah.
If not more. I don't know my homeland, as simple as that. It's as basic as wanting my son to grow up in Palestine, living a life of freedom, of dignity, of equal rights, of safety. Now we are at a point where we fear for the safety of our children on their way to school. Yeah. It's as basic as that.
Yeah, and in Palestine, we call it sumud. We have to persevere. Honestly, I don't think we have a lot of options. And I like how you phrased it about our collective humanity, but also as a tool we have, that we have to use any tool we have. But ultimately, we have to rely on our collective will as Palestinians, our faith.
And our agency. It's our cause. We are the ones who talk about it. We have the agency.
So Dalia, thank you for this conversation. I know we could talk for more hours. And until we meet again in another episode of the Christ at the Checkpoint podcast, I encourage you, if you want to know more about the Balasan Initiative, to visit www.balasan.org.